The greatest of the German idealists and the most influential philosopher of the 19th century was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. A roommate of Schelling's and a friend of the poet Hölderlin, Hegel was concerned to justify the new philosophy and politics of freedom emanating from the West, particularly France and England. But he wanted to do it in a German way, namely in a way consonant with Christianity and the historical community, or you could say the moral value of the historical community. Hegel was influenced by Kant and the Western Enlightenment, to be sure, and also by Fichte and Schelling, but even more by ancient Greek tragedy and his historical studies. The question of the meaning of Christianity in light of the Enlightenment was crucial for Hegel. He wrote many, many books, an enormous system of philosophy. He truly was the last great systematic philosopher. By system I mean a set of books covering virtually every philosophical question in a language that's coordinated to fit together. So he was just about the last completely systematic philosopher. We will spend most of our time looking at his first great work, which was also arguably his most beautiful, and that's The Phenomenology of Spirit. Now, Hegel's question is, can we create a truly systematic philosophy of everything? This is what Schelling wanted to do and what Fichte wanted to do, based in pantheistic or panentheistic spirit, again following his fellow German idealists, but one that does not exclude the reality of human history. History marks the biggest difference he has with his friend Schelling and with his forerunner Fichte. We will explore Hegel's task in his early Phenomenology of Spirit using some examples from the text and conclude by examining his legacy. Now, for all these German writers, they thought that their country, Germany, or their culture needed to be reinvented. And that would mean reinvention through education and culture. Germany at this time, remember, has very little political power. It's conquered by Napoleon, had never really, even for a brief period, been unified as a country. A largely feudal country with a kind of very advanced literary and artistic culture. A Germanic alternative to the Western versions of the Enlightenment would have to be compatible with the German pietist tradition of Christianity, which I described in the last lecture, as well as with the historical and cultural embeddedness of the rational mind. By that I mean, from the German point of view, as a more traditional society than, let's say, England and France, in such a society, one tends to understand a human being's personality and consciousness as embedded in a network of traditional relationships to others, rather than as a sheer individual actor in a capitalist economy. And so there's a communitarian feeling to German philosophy at this point. Now, the 1807 Phenomenology is a masterwork. It was intended merely as an introduction to Hegel's complete system, his encyclopedia, which was later worked out in several volumes. If you like, this is about the most difficult and complex introduction to a text that you could ever want to read. Hegel famously was working on the Phenomenology in Jena when Napoleon marched into the city during his conquest of Central Europe. Now, the aims of the Phenomenology, or the chief aim, is to illustrate the shapes. Now, you have to follow the language here, which I'll try to justify as we go, but it is true that when we're discussing Hegel, one has to make a little bit of a leap of faith into his way of describing things. The Phenomenology's aim is to illustrate the shapes or forms of Geist. Geist just means spirit or mind. We're going to analyze the shapes or forms of Geist as they evolve in human history, from the most narrow and limited toward the perspective of the whole, which means the perspective of God himself. Actual human history chronicles the progressively more mature, more inclusive shapes of spirit. As mentioned last time with Schelling, the notion is God is evolving, and human beings are part of that evolution by which God comes to full self-consciousness or self-recognition. What Hegel is adding here is a detailed analysis of human history. Each step in human history must be a step in that growing consciousness of everything, which leads to the final total awareness of God's awareness of himself. So the great difference between Hegel and his fellow German idealists was that the evolution of the absolute takes place through the actual events of human history, and all the finite limitations of the latter must be patiently worked through before reaching the perspective of the whole. The way Hegel would talk about that in his own language, and again, we're not going too deeply into his language because it takes a lot of practice to understand it. But the way Hegel would talk about it is, you cannot just leap over the negative, you have to work through the negative. And what that means is, you actually have to look at human history and see how you could claim that this historical period had gained an insight, a more inclusive or comprehensive view of the world than an earlier era. Comprehensive, more so than the earlier, but yet not comprehensive enough, and that leads to the next period and the next period. And you actually have to show this piece by piece by piece. Okay. Hegel formulated a new philosophical language, and it's impossible to read him without it. We can only, as I mentioned, go through a bit of it here. Key among his terms is dialectic. Now, we already saw dialectic is an old word. It goes back to Plato, just meant the argument back and forth of philosophers. Dialectic in Kant meant something pejorative. It was when reason tries to know more than it can know, it runs into self-contradictions. Here, Hegel is using it in yet another form. Dialectic is the name Hegel gives to the manner of transition or development. Now, there's a famous way of describing this, namely that all development of any kind, and this Hegel is indeed trying to apply this scheme of development to everything. In other words, to biological development, to the development of the universe, to the development of ideas about the universe, everything. Some people call this the theory of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Those words were actually from Fichte, not Hegel. But they do capture the basic idea. The notion is dialectical development takes place where we begin with something or other, some entity or some position or idea, which, given the context in which it operates, naturally generates opposition or conflict with something else. This conflict then eventually leads to a resolution, a transformation of the opposed elements to form a new unity. Okay? It's in such dialectic that we find the creative advance of spirit and history, to bridge or reincorporate differences at a higher level. That makes progress. So in effect, Hegel is giving a generalized theory of what he considers to be progress. If you want to see examples where you would get this, you would have to think in terms of, let's say, human beings or political movements who fight, and then decide, this is a very simplistic example, decide to settle their differences and unify into a larger community where everybody's rights are somehow respected under a different set of rules. In that case, there's been a conflict leading to integration at a higher level. It's the kind of thing Hegel is talking about. Anyway, any idea or thing or perspective which is finite or limited must imply its opposite or its limitations in the face of that opposition. Anything limited, anything finite must undergo this dialectic. What doesn't undergo it? God in his full, total self-realization. But everything short of that must go through this process of opposition, which means limitation, having a negation, something other than oneself, and then incorporation, and then a new negation and new incorporation. Okay? The point of this dialectical scheme is that it allows Hegel to conceive the development of ideas, philosophies, historical movements, all under one roof. That's the idea.